Okay, today we're looking at present tense use exercise 1, and the instructions were to determine the tense use for the following verbs that were underlined. In making your decision, consider 3 factors: the lexical meaning of the verb, the context, and grammatical features that influence tense usage. For example, does the mood limit the number of tense choices available to the author? So we're going to have a word of prayer and then start with John 5:7. Father, this is the day that you've made. We rejoice in it and are glad. Our hearts desire to have your help in developing the capacities to make fine-grained analytical decisions. I pray that you would touch me as I teach and the students as they learn today. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, but while I am coming, another steps down before me, John 5:7. Clearly what we have here is, the context is the story of the man at the pool of Bethesda, who Jesus asks if he desires to be made well, and he said, yeah, sure, but I don't have anybody to help me. When I'm coming to the pool, another steps down in front of me. Okay, so what use did you give it, Peter? Okay. Okay. Customary. And what was your reason for customary?
Suggested this man has been in state for some time, so he's either reflecting back to an ongoing customary occurrence. I had historic as another option.
Okay. Now, you said durative, Peter. Right. Durative means that the act itself has been in process for an extended length of time, which wouldn't fit this because he isn't in the act of coming for an extended length of time, right? Customary, you can paraphrase a customary present with, I regularly come, and another regularly steps down before me, or customarily. That's got possibilities. I went with historic and then further defined that as progressive, and my reason for use was that the man was describing past experience. It's not what he was doing at that moment, but he was focusing on the progressive nature of the action. Specifically, in terms of the context, the prepositional phrase in ho says that while I'm coming. So you get this in ho communicating it's as I'm in process, somebody gets down there before me. Now, I did something here that probably you didn't know that you could do, and that is that you could mix a historic with a progressive. Okay, so here's my rationale for doing that. There's no grammar that does that, but my analysis is that a historic present is an incomplete description of the pragmatic use of the tense. Sure, it's used to make a past event realistic, and that's why we label it historic. But what about the nature of the action involved? Is it instantaneous? Is it progressive? Is it iterative? Is it, the historic only tells me that we've taken a past event and brought it into the present for vividness. It doesn't really tell me anything about the nature of the action itself. So that reason, there's a sense in which we are almost talking about tense use in terms of literary impact and tense use in terms of portrayal of action. Historic is literary impact. Progressive is portrayal of action. Does that make sense? Okay. We ask, how is the present tense used? Well, used to do what? Well, it's used to have a literary impact on us, dramatize the action, and it's also used to portray the nature of the action, in this case, progressive. And that's, of course, supported by the lexical nature of the verb itself, which is coming in progressive. Questions?
Yeah, as we go through these, can you help me a lot on the reason for use? I'm looking. Okay, it says historic, progressive, so I'm trying to work through the 1, 2, 3 in the instructions.
I'm sorry, you need to tell me when my screen's not on. I thought that...
I didn't know it was supposed to be. I thought you were using it.
No. So he's describing a past experience, not a present experience. But he focuses on the progressive nature of the action. So that's a component of context. An additional component of context in Ho tells me that we've got in process. Then the lexical nature of the verbs. Well, erkomai is coming. So here's what I'm going to do, Peter. I'm going to work with the 3 factors Wallace talks about and try to point out something about as many of them as I can come up with. Okay, now, grammatical factors, I can't think of any grammatical factor that impinges on the portrayal of the action here. I can see lexical and I can see contextual.
Okay. And as we move through these, when mood matters, can you point it out to me?
Well, mood's going to matter whenever it limits tense options, subjunctive, imperative, and optative.
Yeah, but if it's indicative, then it doesn't limit.
Mood doesn't limit anything, no.
Okay.
No.
And then, if you did have something that wasn't indicative, like a subjunctive, then what is it limited to?
Present and aorist.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Let me just... Okay. Move on to the next one. John 15:27, and you. But you also are bearing witness because you are with me from the beginning. Okay. So you were asked to identify the use of are with me from the beginning. So
I put perfective because I thought we were emphasizing that you have been, I don't know, I'm feeling rather uncomfortable right now.
well, read me the definition that Wallace gives for perfective.
The present tense may be used to emphasize as a result of a past action or spoken from you.
Okay, so the way that's worded indicates that the action is no longer happening, but the results are. Which would mean the action of are was no longer happening, but the results were.
But R doesn't have that kind of action.
No, are is stated. Yeah. Okay, so Sam, what'd you put?
Extending from past to present.
Okay, so that's Wallace's term for what the handbook calls a durative. Okay, and I believe that's what I said. Yeah, durative stative. My reason for use durative is the phrase from the beginning. Stative, if you're focusing on the nature of a me, because a me is stative, or progressive if you're focusing on the actual action that took place. They have been with him from the beginning. They walked with him. They slept with where he was sleeping. They so on. Okay, so I point out a lexical reason. A me is stative. I point out a contextual reason from the beginning. I can't think of a grammatical reason. All right, the next one, 1 Corinthians 9:26. I therefore run so as not without purpose. I fight, not as I buffet my body, not as beating the air. Bring it into bondage. Okay, Peter, what did you have for that?
Put progressive when it's not narrative literature, so, but that doesn't mean it can't be progressive.
That's right. Okay, so progressive. Explain what that means to me.
Well, I'm open to Wallace right now, and he says viewing the scene as in progress.
Okay, so that would be saying Paul is portraying himself as fighting, as running. I'm right now fighting. I'm right now running. I'm right now buffeting my body. I'm right now bringing it into bondage. Okay, that's an option. What did you say, Sam?
I said customary. I thought that this was broader than iterative, but narrower than gnomic. And it doesn't seem to me like he's speaking in a narrow band.
Okay.
So I thought that might be the good option.
Okay. I'm not at all opposed to customary. I think we could argue for that. Now, it would be nice if there was something in the context that suggested regularity, like I do this always or something like that. And then that would help us a little better, I think, decide between customary and iterative. We could argue, well, Paul was we can argue psychologically, Paul was a very meticulous person. And so it's likely that this was a regular habit. Okay.
I guess I don't really understand customary. Wallace says that it signals either an action that regularly occurs or an ongoing state. What regularly occurs, wouldn't that be iterative? An ongoing state would be progressive, so I don't understand the difference, I suppose.
I don't have a book in front of me, but I thought he gave a slight difference between iterative and customary as refers to an ongoing.
Okay, the issue is this is one of the ambiguities of Wallace, which is one of the reasons why I have you read the handbook as well, because I think that we helped clarify some of Wallace's ambiguities. Okay, and so with the durative present denotes an action. Customary. That's what I'm looking for. We don't have a customary present. What in the world?
Yeah, I knew it. Yeah, I knew it. I
I guess we subsumed the customary under iterative. The argument would be that, see, I would disagree with Wallace's categorization. I'm not going to call an ongoing state a customary action. I'm just going to call it a progressive. It's ongoing. Whether it's stative or transitive or intransitive, doesn't matter. It's ongoing. We're going to call a thing iterative if there are breaks in the action or the state across time, right? And then you can call, as a subset of iterative, habitual or customary, and that just focuses on the regularity with which the act takes place. Okay? So that's not actually going to be a function of the tense itself. The tense isn't going to tell you the regularity of the action. That's either part of the lexical nature of the verb or it's part of the context, not the tense itself. The tense is used to indicate progress, whether it's linear progress or iterative progress. Do you understand what I just said?
Yeah, I understand the last thing you said, but
Is there any way I can look at one of those?
yeah, you were right. He does give examples that you have very good memory of. So if I'm trying to make a decision between if something's a customary or an iterative,
You're going to look for contextual justification for the regularity of the.
and if there's regularity, then it would be customary.
Yeah.
He says that it's different in terms of time frame as well as regularity. The intervals are shorter with the iterative and less regular, however, several passages are difficult to with either category.
Yeah, he says it's the customary present is the iterative with the temporal ends kicked out.
Is he just thinking about the aspect in that it has a iterative aspect, but the time restraints aren't like reining it in as much as
I guess,
the iterative.
I fast twice a week. That's clearly iterative.
Well, not with regards to time restraints if you have the definition, right? Because it would be habitual.
No, I'm just saying the nature of the action is iterative.
Okay,
Yeah. Now, let's just say I am fasting. Or I fast often.
Yeah.
How is the time more constrained in I fast often versus I fast twice a week?
It's not. It would be, the difference would be the habituality or the
regularity.
Often would be iterative, as where I fast twice a week would be customary.
Yeah, so I'm just not sure that Wallace's statement, the customary present is an iterative with the temporal ends kicked out, is necessarily helpful. I would rather say customary is a subset of iterative when the context makes clear that we have regularity in view. Now, that's the theory. Let's talk about a practical example. John says, he who has been born of God is not sinning. Now, we know from context that he's going to allow for the option of someone to sin. 1 John 2:1. So he does not have in view a singular act. which would put us into the iterative category. Because a person who does a singular act is sinning in the moment of that action. Right? He could be portrayed as progressive.
If it doesn't have the habitual nature, though, would it mean something like he's not random sinning, whereas customary would even rein that in more, because, I mean, it's still possible for a Christian to randomly sin as long as, but they're not habitually sinning.
Yeah, that's where I think the word habitual is helpful. This is not the characteristic, and that's the preferred word I use. Someone who is sinning is characterized by. That seems to fit customary. And that adds a dimension that regularity doesn't really add. It's not so much that he sins regularly. Yeah, I sin every day at 1 o'clock. But that his life, when graphed across time, is characterized by. And so those are the two dimensions of the category customary that I have put in my mind. Regularity is one option. Characterized by is another option. And I'm not saying it's different from durative in that it's not that the act of sinning was carried on over a long period of time. It's different from gnomic in that it's just always true. And it's not simply iterative. Though it is iterative, right? It is that, but it's not just that. Now, theologically, I want to step in here and say, the one who has been born of God is not committing sin and first of all, the type of sin John has in mind is willful sin. So is not characterized by a choice to do what he knows is wrong. He's characterized by choosing to do what he knows is right. He is born of God, does righteousness. And I think that helps fill out the picture beyond simply what a focus on the tense can do. And this is why pragmatics is theologically important. We want to allow the context to appropriately nuance our understanding of what's going on. Question?
Yeah. With the graph analogy, if you just graph out somebody's life and without taking in sort of the property of habituality, it seems possible that you could still have an iterative nature, like even though it's less random, it's still, especially if you remove time constraints, it's still, and since that's not what we want to communicate from John, I guess if that's what John means, it would seem like the habituality would be sort of necessary for the meaning, because right? If it's just a graph, then there can be points all over the graph that would seem to correspond, stretched out, if we're just kicking out the ends and allowing it to go from the beginning to end.
Yeah, there are problems with the analogy, especially because when you add in granularity to the graph, if you back out far enough, any series of points can look like a line. Okay.
Yeah.
But the sense I get out of John's, well, let's say it this way, the sense that Wallace gets out of John drives him to say that John is talking proleptically. He's not talking about what can be true of a believer in the here and now. He's talking about what shall be true in the future.
And that's what the
Proleptic means to speak of the future as though it's present. Okay. And so he reads John as saying, you aren't sinning. And since his theology says, yeah, but I am sinning, he concludes, well, since we're all sinning, either none of us are born of God, or John must be talking about the future. No, he's in print saying that. Okay. And I say, well, we're not all sinning. Okay, if you understand that John's talking about willful sin, which I think is really clear from the context, light versus darkness, then no, we're not. And if you are, you ought to be scared. And so when I taught through 1 John at Bob Jones, it wasn't at all unusual to have students coming into my office and saying, this is bothering me. I mean, how many points in a row on the graph do I have to have before I'm characterized by? And, I'm sympathetic to the reality that people have habituated sinful patterns, and that the habituation of sin makes it more difficult then for there to be an instantaneous break and a total cessation. And yet, I have to say that God's grace is sufficient, and a person ought to be able to observe their life and see that they are making progress toward greater and greater extended periods of time in which there is no commission of willful sin, and their goal to be the complete extirpation of that in whatever given area we're looking at. And I think it's important to, let's say that I habituated lustful thinking. Okay. So then I want to remove this habit. And I'm not saying, well, on this day, I've got 7 days here when I didn't lust, but up a different category, I was unkind to my wife. Different category, and I got dots, Now, maybe that's where Wallace speaks up and says, see, I told you, you're sinning. And you guys are playing with the chart by isolating a single area, and if you look across the whole strand, you say, well, okay, but should we not observe a consistent pattern of choosing to do right across the whole spectrum? And that consistency becoming more and more apparent as we grow in grace and maturity? Otherwise, you either got to do what Wallace does and kick John into the future, say, well, he's talking hyperbolically and theoretically, and someday we'll all get there, in which case you just essentially eviscerate the argument that John makes between the contrast of the sons of the devil and the sons of God, because we're all then sons of the devil. Some of us just are going to become better in the future. Right? Or we say, no, there's growth in this habituation of the practicing of righteousness.
I kind of feel like because I remember in a footnote he talks about how we make decisions based upon hunch instead of strict grammatical analysis. And I kind of feel like perhaps he may be doing that in the 1 John instance, in 1 John 3. Perhaps he may be doing that in the 1 John instance, in 1 John 3, instead of just sticking to grammar and applying it rigorously. He's allowing sort of his theological bias to sort of override better options.
Well, I want to be careful when I make that criticism because I'm vulnerable to it myself.
Well, no, I understand that, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that. I don't know. I mean, it seems unless you're willing to say that his option is as legitimate an option grammatically and syntactically as.
No, I think it's less likely, significantly less likely, given the entire
So I'm not
context
saying
of
anything
John.
about my righteousness. I'm just saying, hey, you know, given the criteria,
Yeah, right.
you're not living up to your own standard. You know.
Well, yeah, I think that's a valid point. And the very fact that he calls this an exegetically difficult passage testifies to the fact that he feels the bite of the grammatical analysis.
Have you ever talked to him?
And not about that.
Do you know him to some degree?
I know him as well as a person that you've met one time. Yeah. No, Wallace does not know me. He doesn't know I exist.
I mean, he might. I mean, you vetted it in the Greek.
Maybe, whatever. If he reads Hebrew, he's got his nose in too many Greek manuscripts. John 7:52. Behold, because out of Galilee no prophet ariseth. Right? Sam?
I have gnomic because it's a negation.
All right, Peter?
And I have context. It's a metaphorical arise. Can be seen as extensive beyond instantaneous lexical. And it seems to be referring to a broad span time relation.
Okay. The context is particularly going to help that analysis. Right? Isn't this the Pharisees saying to Nicodemus?
Yeah.
Yeah. This never happens. Go search the scriptures.
I thought it was a true context because I thought it was emphasizing that it hasn't, and the reason we don't believe it because it's not likely going to happen.
Okay, read the definition of conative.
Conative is misuse of the present tense portrays the subject as desirous to do something, attempting to do something, or at the point of almost doing something. And then true conative is further defined. The present tense is used to indicate that the tense is being made at the present time. Often it bears the connotation that the action will not be completed.
I'm trying to put together that definition and a negative. This says, out of Galilee a prophet does not arise. Prophetes uk egeretai. If you add a not, how can the subject be attempting? He is not attempting to do something. He is not almost doing something. So not really, I mean, I see what you're doing with the definition, but not messes it up.
I don't understand why I don't see these things when I'm working through it myself.
It's all right. That's why you come to school.
So I'm sorry, what is Sam?
Gnomic is the correct answer. The reason for the use is essentially the context. The Pharisees are telling Nicodemus, hey.
Why do you have narrow band?
arise is going to be an action of limited duration. Although if you argue for, I take arise to mean be born in. And I think they're right. Although I think somewhere in the back of my mind I remember somebody disputing the claim that there was a prophet who was born in Galilee. But that's what I understand arise to mean metaphorically, be born in. And of course that's not true of Jesus because he was born in Judea. If you think it is to gain prominence over time, then you would say it's broadband. So it just depends on how you're understanding the metaphor. Peter?
I'm sorry, could you go back to reasons for use? The context, is it because the Pharisees are saying that scripturally this doesn't happen?
Yeah, this never happens. All right, Acts 16:18, but Paul, being sore troubled, turned and said to the Spirit, I charge thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her. Okay. Peter?
Sorry, what month are we on?
Acts 16:18.
Oh, Acts 16:18. I put instantaneous.
Okay, and what was your reason for the use?
I'm not sure other than, it's just, that's what I'm struggling with.
Lexical nature of the verb. What's the lexical nature of charging somebody?
Well, it's something, charging someone is something that you do instantaneously. Can you be charging someone over a period of time? I don't think so.
You could do it repeatedly, but you couldn't do it continuously. I charge you takes place in the moment of saying the verb charge.
So how do I explain myself? Simply because
you say the nature of the verb's action is instantaneous. And that was my reason for use. Instantaneous present, lexical nature of charging.
I had that, but I also thought that perhaps it might be historical too, since if you take present to, if the idea is that it's a rhetorical present and you emphasize aspect being within, it seems it looked like in verse 17, maybe it's in verse 17, there's a switch from the aorist to the present. And I thought I remembered in Wallace where that would be, that at times indicates like a change from, kind of moving forward to now, getting involved in the action. So I thought that might be a grammatical reason.
Okay, well, I think what you're saying is right, but direct discourse messes it up.
Oh, the I charge thee? Yeah.
Yeah. So he turned and said, comma, open quote. And now we have a direct quote from Paul. And so you're not going to put a direct quote from Paul in the past tense, even though you're telling a story about the past. If we're in direct discourse.
But okay, thank you. That's, I was under the impression that the historical present, even though it's okay, it isn't in the past tense. But why is it again that you can't have direct discourse in a historic present as long as it's being represented as ongoing in the moment, in the narrative? Because it is. It obviously. I doubt Luke was writing that while he was.
No, right, sure, yeah. It's he's recounting a past event, but it's he's recounting a past event, but in a direct discourse construction, we're reporting the words the person said. And in the time frame in which they were said, they're not a historic present. So I'm looking at Paul's use of the present tense, not Luke's use of the present tense.
How can Paul's use be independent of Luke's use?
Well, it's independent because it's a quotation. So Paul said it this way, and Luke just reports what he says. Whereas if Luke,
No, it's in a sense it's because it's a direct discourse. No matter when you represent it, it's always going to be as if it's present right now.
yes,
I don't understand why that is, but I don't like
well,
distinctions like that.
Explain to me how it could be other than that.
Well, I guess I thought that the historic present would do a good job with that because the historic present is not. In a sense, it's rhetorically, if I understand Wallace correctly, rhetorically representing present, even though it's not literally representing present time.
Here's a test to put. If you could turn the present tense into an past tense and have it make sense in context, that's a good gauge for historic present. So if Luke had said, but Paul, having turned to the Spirit, is saying, legi, I charge you. Then you can say, whoa, that legi could just as easily be epen, he said. But you can't say Paul said, I was charging you in the name of Jesus, because that doesn't make any sense out of what Paul wouldn't have said, I was charging you. He would have said, I now charge you. Okay.
So
this
that
isn't
criteria wouldn't work if they changed it to indirect discourse?
if they he said that he was charging it. Yes, wouldn't that be how we would say it? We would say he said that. Well, actually, Greek retains the original tense of the direct discourse, even in indirect discourse. So,
Okay.
which is different than English.
Okay.
So it might still work in indirect discourse too.
Okay.
So what
Not
you,
historic.
yeah, a historic. It's an action that would naturally be described in a past tense, but then gets dramatized by the use of the present. And this wouldn't fit that. I've read all the Gospels in Greek, and Mark's the guy who uses the historic present over and over and over, and I've never seen any variation from that. So, okay, next one, John 1:28. I'm going to have to quit with this one because I got a meeting in 4 minutes. These things were done in Bethany beyond the Jordan where John was baptizing. On the morrow he sees Jesus coming. This is a historic present, clearly. And we can say it's a historic progressive. We use the present tense that's the literary side of it. The present tense, Jesus coming in particular, the ergomenon, this is a great place where I can argue for a grammatical impingement on aspect. And that is that indirect discourse with participles is invariably used when the action being perceived is in progress. And so the fact that John uses indirect discourse here, that is a grammatical structure which argues for a specific aspectual portrayal.
I'm not sure I caught that. Can you repeat that again?
indirect discourse with participles is invariably used when the participle's action is in process, or the results of the participle's action are in process. So that would be a perfect tense verb. But most indirect discourse participles are present. He sees him coming. I see him walking. I hear him talking. This is an in-process event. And so as I observe that inductively across a broad array of examples, that then becomes a grammatical deduction, which I can then apply to any one point and talk about the aspect from a grammatical standpoint. All right, well, our time